The leak was discovered on a Tuesday, which was, in retrospect, the least surprising part of the whole thing. It was raining hard that morning, the kind of rain that makes Chicago look like a city that has given up on itself. And Laurel Voss was already 40 minutes into a conference call she didn't need to be on when her assistant knocked twice and slipped a note under the door. She didn't look at it right away. She was listening to her CFO explain, in excruciating detail, why the Q3 projections were softer than expected, and she had learned years ago that the moment you broke eye contact with a speakerphone, someone in the room would take it as permission to say something stupid. She picked up the note when the call ended. Water damage, second floor, server room. Facilities called someone. Laurel set the note down, looked out her window at the gray sheet of rain hammering Lake Michigan, and thought, of course. She had bought the Alderton building 18 months ago as part of a calculated bet. A 1920s financial landmark in the middle of the loop, half derelict, full of original marble and bad electrical, and the kind of bones that made restoration architects go quiet with reverence. The plan was to convert it into the new headquarters of Voss Capital Partners, the private equity firm she had built from scratch over 14 years. The symbolism was intentional. The building had survived the Depression. It had survived 2 recessions and a fire in 1987 that took out the entire 5th floor. Laurel liked things that survived. What the building had not survived, apparently, was 12 hours of sustained rainfall and a section of deteriorated roofing that her previous contractor had assured her, twice in writing, was sealed and structurally sound. She took the elevator to the 2nd floor. The water wasn't catastrophic, not yet. It had come through the ceiling in one concentrated section near the northeast corner, pooled across 60 square feet of subfloor, and was currently dripping at an unhurried pace onto a stack of equipment crates that had been moved there 2 days earlier. The facilities manager, a nervous man named Phil, was standing in the doorway, looking like he'd rather be anywhere else on Earth. "I called the restoration contractor," Phil said, the original firm. "But they said they can't get anyone out here until Thursday." "Thursday," Laurel repeated. "Maybe Friday." She looked at the ceiling. There was a bloom of waterlogged plaster about the diameter of a dining table, and in its center, a steady drip that had already carved a small channel through the gypsum dust on the floor. "Who else did you call?" Phil pulled out his phone and scrolled. "There's a firm, smaller, independent, did the mechanical work on the Brennan restoration last year. I've got a number. Call them." He called. They answered. And that was how Jonah Marks ended up standing in Laurel's half-finished building at 11:15 on a Tuesday morning, dripping on her marble floor and looking at her ceiling like it had personally insulted him. He was not what she had expected. She wasn't sure what she had expected. Someone older, maybe. Or someone who said things like load-bearing and moisture barrier and immediately started measuring things with a laser level. Jonah Marks was somewhere in his late 30s, with the kind of hands that come from actual work and a canvas jacket that had seen better decades. He had a small girl with him, maybe 5, maybe 6, who was holding his hand and looking at the lobby's original bronze elevator doors with an expression of pure, unguarded wonder. "Sorry about her," Jonah said when he caught Laurel looking. "Her school's on a water day. I couldn't get a sitter on 40 minutes' notice." "What's a water day?" "It's exactly what it sounds like," he said. "They bring out water tables and sprinklers. The kids love it. The teachers are saints." He glanced down at the girl. "This is Willa. She's 6. She won't touch anything." Willa looked up at Laurel with dark, serious eyes. "Your floors are very shiny," she said. "Thank you," Laurel said. "We haven't actually finished them yet. They're still the shiniest floors I've ever seen." Jonah cleared his throat. "Could I see the damage?" He was quiet for a long time when he saw it. He didn't whistle or shake his head or do any of the theatrical things that contractors sometimes do when they want you to brace for a number. He just crouched down at the edge of the water damage, pressed 2 fingers flat against the subfloor, and then stood up and looked at the ceiling again with an expression that Laurel could not entirely read. "The roof was sealed recently," he said. "It wasn't a question. 8 months ago. The previous contractor certified it." He was quiet again. He walked the perimeter of the damage slowly, hands in his pockets, and Laurel noticed he kept coming back to the same corner, the northeast corner where the drip was concentrated. He looked at the wall there. He pressed his palm flat against the plaster in two spots, then a third. "Can I see the certification paperwork?" he asked. "I can have it pulled and the original inspection report from before the seal job." She looked at him. Most contractors didn't ask for the inspection report. They asked about the scope of work and the timeline and whether there were union restrictions on the job site. "I'll have Phil get it," she said. What he found over the next 2 hours was methodical and quiet and deeply unsettling. The roofing seal wasn't defective. It had been applied incorrectly, not through negligence, but through a series of decisions that, individually, might each have been chalked up to error, but together formed a pattern that made the back of Laurel's neck go cold. The sealant had been applied over a moisture trap rather than through it. The drainage channel along the northeast parapet had been redirected, subtly, almost invisibly, so that water pooled instead of shedding. And the inspection report, which she had signed off on 8 months ago, listed a series of measurements that did not correspond to the actual dimensions of the space. Jonah laid the report on a dry section of floor and looked at her. "Someone built a funnel," he said. Laurel stood very still. "What do you mean?" "I mean, this didn't happen because of bad workmanship. The roof is structurally fine. But every design choice up here, the drainage redirect, the sealant application, the way the parapet cap was set, it funnels water directly into this corner." He tapped the northeast wall. "Into this corner, specifically where your server room is. Or where your server room was going to be, once the build-out was finished." She looked at the wall, then at him. "You're saying it was deliberate?" He didn't answer right away. He picked up the inspection report again and looked at the measurements. Then he set it back down. "I'm saying the probability of this pattern occurring by accident is very low," he said. "What it means is your call, but I'd make that call before I let the original contractor back on this property." The original contractor was Hensley and Associates. They had been brought in 18 months ago by her COO, a man named Garrett Finch. Her COO and, for the past 11 years, the closest thing to a partner she had ever had in the business. Garrett had recommended Hensley personally, had vetted them personally, had managed the contract relationship himself at his own insistence because, he said, he didn't want to overload her plate while she was handling the Meridian Capital acquisition. She had trusted him. She had been trusting him for 11 years. She went back to her office and sat for a long time without turning on the lights. Garrett Finch had come to Voss Capital Partners in the company's 4th year, when it was still small enough that everyone knew everyone, and decisions got made in a conference room the size of a closet. He was sharp and efficient and had a particular talent for seeing 3 moves ahead in a negotiation, which was exactly what Laurel needed. Over the years, as the firm grew, so did Garrett's role. He managed operations, managed relationships, managed a staff of 40. He was, in every practical sense, the second most powerful person at Voss Capital. He was also, Laurel now understood, the person with the most to gain if Voss Capital ceased to exist in its current form. She had known for 6 months that Garrett had been in private conversations with Meridian Capital, the same firm she had outbid for a portfolio acquisition last year. She had assumed those conversations were about a job offer. She had been prepared to negotiate his compensation, even to restructure his equity stake, rather than lose him. She had not until this moment considered the possibility that the conversations were about something else entirely. She picked up her phone and called her attorney. Jonah finished his preliminary assessment around 4 o'clock. Willa had long since settled herself on a square of drop cloth in the corner of the lobby with a book that appeared to be about deep-sea creatures, and was reading it with the focused intensity of a graduate student. Phil had brought her a granola bar at some point, and she had thanked him with great formality. Jonah found Laurel on the 2nd floor, standing at the window that looked north toward the river. "I can stabilize the damage tonight," he said. "Stop the active water intrusion, put down moisture barriers, protect the subfloor from further warping." The full restoration will take 2 to 3 weeks depending on what we find when we open up the wall. She nodded, still looking at the river. Mrs. Voss. She turned. You should know, he said carefully, that the way the drainage redirect was installed, it required someone to be inside the building. Someone with access. It's not something that could have been done from the roof. She had already known this. Hearing it said aloud was different. How long have you been doing this? She asked. Restoration work? About 12 years. Before that, I did structural assessment for a firm in Pittsburgh. Is this the kind of thing you see often? Deliberate damage? He considered the question seriously. More often than most people would want to know, he said. Usually insurance fraud, occasionally contract disputes. Sometimes it's personal. He paused. The person who designed this knew what they were doing. They didn't just want to create damage. They wanted it to look like age. Like an old building failing in an expected way. But you caught it. The measurements in the inspection report gave it away. Nobody fakes measurements unless they're hiding something. He said it matter-of-factly, without any suggestion that he found it particularly remarkable. Do you want me to document everything formally? Chain of custody, photographic record, the whole process? She looked at him for a moment. He had spent 4 hours in her building and had not once asked her what the firm did, or what the building was worth, or how big the restoration budget was. He had asked about inspection reports and drainage specifications. Yes, she said, I want everything documented. Then I'll start tonight. She nodded. Then, because it seemed important, your daughter. It's almost dinner. I'll call my neighbor. She can pick Willa up. He took out his phone and stepped away, and Laurel heard him explain, briefly and with obvious familiarity, that something had come up at a job site and could Mrs. Paulson take Willa for the evening. Apparently Mrs. Paulson could. Before Willa left, she came and stood in front of Laurel with the deep-sea creatures book tucked under her arm. Do you work here? Willa asked. I own the building, Laurel said. Willa appeared to consider this. My dad is going to fix it, she said. I know. He always fixes things, Willa said. That's his whole thing. Then Mrs. Paulson arrived, and Willa left, and the building got quiet, and Jonah Marks started cutting open walls. What they found in the walls was worse than the ceiling. Over the next 3 days, working with a small crew he trusted, Jonah documented 17 distinct points of compromised infrastructure throughout the building. Not all of it was deliberate. Some of it was genuinely the old building showing its age. But 8 of the 17 points bore the same signature as the roof, design choices that were defensible in isolation and indefensible in aggregate. The fire suppression system on the 3rd floor had been plumbed with a pressure configuration that would have caused catastrophic failure under high flow. The main electrical panel's grounding system had been modified in a way that would have been invisible to a standard inspection, but would have presented a serious risk once the building reached full occupancy. The elevator shaft on the north side had been reinforced with the wrong load specification, not dangerously wrong, not yet, but wrong in the specific way that becomes dangerous over time. Jonah showed her all of it, point by point, in an evening meeting that Laurel sat through without speaking for almost an hour. He had a habit, she had noticed, of presenting information without editorializing. He said what he found and what it meant, and then went quiet, giving her space to draw her own conclusions. It was an unusual quality in anyone. She was beginning to find it something close to restoring. If this building had opened on schedule, she said finally, what would have happened? The roof issue would have surfaced within 1 to 3 rainy seasons, possibly framed as normal water intrusion in an old building. He paused. The electrical panel eventually would have caused a fire. The investigation would likely have focused on the age of the original wiring. So it would have looked like the building failed. Yes. And the valuation of my firm, which is partially collateralized against this property, would have been significantly impaired, he said. Yes. Laurel sat with that for a moment. The firm's balance sheet was not public, but anyone who understood private equity could reverse engineer the exposure. Meridian Capital could, Garrett Finch could. She called her attorney again that night. The attorney's name was Suzanne Park. sharp, compact, with the particular energy of someone who had spent 20 years being underestimated and had decided to use it as a competitive advantage. When Laurel laid out what she had, all of it, Suzanne listened without interrupting and then asked 4 questions in rapid succession. The fourth question was, "Do you have anyone on the inside at Meridian?" Laurel said she did not. "You need to move carefully," Suzanne said. "If Finch has been feeding them information, they may already be positioned to respond to a move against him. The moment he knows you know, he can trigger a disclosure to your LPs that creates enough uncertainty to tank your fundraising round. I know. The documentation your contractor is compiling, that's your foundation. But you need a second line. Something that shows intent, not just outcome." Laurel knew what that meant. She had been thinking about it since Jonah had mentioned the drainage redirect required inside access logs. She had security cameras that covered every entrance to the building, and the Alderton's access system logged every keycard entry and exit. The system had been one of the first things she'd installed before the restoration began, because she was moving sensitive documents into the building during construction, and she was careful about that kind of thing. She pulled the logs the next morning. Garrett's keycard had accessed the building 14 times over the past 8 months. 11 of those times were logged alongside other staff, site walkthroughs. She had records for all of them. 3 were solo entries, after hours, on dates that corresponded to the installation timeline that Jonah had mapped from the structural evidence. She sent the logs to Suzanne at 7 a.m. and then sat in her kitchen and drank a cup of coffee and looked at her phone for a long time. 11 years. She thought about the day Garrett had walked into her office in the firm's 4th year, in the conference room the size of a closet, and she had liked him immediately because he had done his homework and asked the right questions and didn't try to mansplain her own portfolio to her. She thought about the Kinsley deal, which had almost collapsed at midnight on a Friday, and which Garrett had salvaged by staying on the phone for 6 straight hours. She thought about the time her mother had died, sudden and early, and Garrett had handled 2 weeks of her calendar without being asked and without saying anything about it, just made it so she could breathe. She thought about the fact that a person could be genuine in some things and not in others. That it was possible to work alongside someone for 11 years and not know the whole of them. That trust, once broken, revealed itself to have been a different shape than you thought. She finished her coffee, put the cup in the sink, and went to work. Jonah finished the full documentation on a Friday evening. He brought it to her in a binder, actual paper, organized and indexed, and set it on her conference table and said, 86 pages. Everything has a timestamp, a photograph, and a measurement record. I also had my structural engineer review the load spec discrepancies independently, so you have 2 signatures on those. She looked at the binder, then at him. You didn't have to have your engineer review it independently, she said. That's above what I asked for. It's what the evidence needs if it's going to hold up, he said. She nodded. Then, after a moment, "Can I ask you something?" He sat down across from her, which no one in her professional life did without being invited. She found she didn't mind. "When you walked in here that first day," she said, "you asked for the original inspection report before you even looked at the ceiling. Most contractors don't do that." He thought about it. "My father was a contractor," he said. "He got hired once to fix a job that turned out to have been deliberately compromised. Insurance fraud situation. The building owner and the original contractor had an arrangement. My father's work ended up being used to obscure the original damage rather than document it. He didn't realize until the lawsuit." He paused. "So I always look at the paper first. The paper tells you what someone wanted you to believe." Laurel was quiet for a moment. "Did your father's situation resolve?" "Eventually. He lost 2 years of work and a lot of sleep, but eventually, yes." A brief pause. "Will is named after his mother. He died before she was born. She hadn't known that. There was no reason she should have. She had known this man for 2 weeks. But it landed the way certain things land when you are already tired and already raw from the particular grief of a long betrayal, and she had to look out the window for a moment. "I'm sorry," she said. "Thank you," he said, simply, without performance. Outside, the city was lit and moving, and the river was dark and flat. The meeting she called was a Monday morning board session, standard enough on its face that Garrett had no reason to expect it was anything other than a routine governance update. He walked in at 9 o'clock with his laptop and a coffee and sat in his usual chair, 3 seats down from Laurel's right, and started pulling up his notes. Suzanne Park was already in the room. She had arranged herself at the far end of the table with the careful casualness of a person who is not trying to look like what she is, which was a person about to make something legally decisive happen. Jonah was not in the room. His part was done. His binder was in front of Laurel. Also in the room were the 3 independent board members, Laurel's head of compliance, and a representative from the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit, who had been very interested in the access logs and the Meridian connection when Suzanne had reached out on Thursday. Garrett noticed the FBI agent at approximately the same moment the FBI agent turned to look at him, and there was a window of 3 or 4 seconds where everything that had been invisible became visible, where the last 11 years reorganized themselves in the light of a single sustained second of understanding, and Garrett Finch looked at Laurel across the conference table with an expression that was not quite guilt and not quite defiance, but something older and more tired than either. She did not look away. She didn't say anything to him. There was nothing she needed to say. She had said everything she needed to say in the 86 pages in front of her and in the logs, and in the 3 years of financial records that Suzanne's team had flagged as the predicate for what the FBI was now calling a coordinated scheme to devalue the asset base of Voss Capital Partners in advance of a hostile secondary buyout attempt by Meridian Capital. The board members asked their questions. Suzanne answered most of them. The FBI agent said very little but wrote a great deal. Garrett's attorney, who had been called and had arrived by 9:15, advised him not to speak. He didn't speak. The whole thing took 2 hours. Afterward, when the room had cleared, Laurel sat alone at the conference table for a while. She wasn't thinking about Garrett. She wasn't thinking about Meridian. She was thinking, strangely, about the marble floors in the lobby and about a 6-year-old who had said they were the shiniest she had ever seen. She called Jonah that afternoon. "It's done," she said. There was a brief pause on the line. "Good," he said. And then, "How are you doing?" It was such a direct question, asked without preamble or buffer, that she almost didn't know how to answer it. Most of the people in her professional life would have asked about next steps, or the board's response, or the timeline for the legal process. Jonah asked how she was doing. "I've been better," she said honestly. "I've also been worse." "That's about right for a Tuesday," he said. She almost laughed. It was a small almost, but it was there. "The building," she said. "When can you start the actual restoration?" "I can have a crew there Thursday. We'll start with the 3rd floor and work down. You'll be able to occupy the 1st floor in about 6 weeks if everything goes cleanly. And if it doesn't go cleanly, then it'll take 8 weeks, and I'll tell you why." She thought about what it meant that she found this deeply reassuring, the simple promise of being told the truth about the timeline. "Thursday," she said. "Thursday," he said. She came down to the building that Thursday morning before her first call. It was early, just past 7, and the city was still in its gray morning state, cabs and delivery trucks, and a woman walking a very large dog who seemed to be reconsidering his life choices in the rain. Laurel stood in the lobby with a coffee and watched Jonah's crew arrive. 4 people, efficient and quiet, hauling equipment in from a truck double-parked on Dearborn Street. Jonah was the last in, holding the lobby door for the last of his crew members and then stopping when he saw her. "You didn't have to come in early," he said. "I know." He looked at her for a moment with an expression she was starting to recognize, careful, direct, not unkind. Then he nodded once and walked past her toward the stairwell, and she heard him start talking to his crew about the day's plan in the particular voice of a person who has been leading teams long enough that it requires no effort and no performance. She finished her coffee. Willa came again that Saturday when Jonah was doing a solo review of the 3rd floor progress, and apparently Mrs. Paulson was visiting her sister in Naperville. Willa arrived with a backpack and a new book, this one about volcanoes, and immediately set herself up on the same square of drop cloth in the lobby corner as if it had been reserved for her. "I remember this floor," Willa said. "The floor remembers you," Laurel said, which was possibly the strangest thing she had said to anyone in recent memory, but Willa accepted it as perfectly normal. She sat on a folding chair near Willa for 20 minutes, answering emails, while the building rang quietly with the sounds of careful work happening above them. At some point, Willa looked up from her volcano book and said, "My dad says this building is actually really old, but really strong. He says that's the best kind of thing to be." Laurel looked at her screen for a moment. Then she set the phone down. "Your dad's pretty smart," she said. "I know," Willa said, and went back to her volcanoes with the confidence of someone reporting an established fact. The restoration took 7 weeks. Not 6, not 8, 7. Exactly as Jonah had revised his estimate after the third floor wall revealed an additional section of compromised plumbing that they hadn't found in the initial assessment. He had called her the day they found it, explained what it was and what it would cost and why it changed the timeline by 1 week, and asked if she wanted to proceed. She had said yes. He had said he would have a revised written scope to her by 5 o'clock. It was in her inbox at 4:50. She thought about that sometimes, about the particular reliability of a person who does what they say and says what they mean and shows up when they say they'll show up. She had built a career around evaluating people and assets, and she knew, with the same certainty she brought to an investment thesis, that this quality, the rare and unremarkable quality of being exactly what you appear to be, was worth more than almost anything else she had ever tried to underwrite. On the last day of the restoration, Jonah walked the building from the 5th floor to the basement, checking every item on a punch list that was 14 pages long, and when he was done, he came and found her in what would become her office on the 4th floor and said, "It's done. Everything on the list." She looked up from her desk, a temporary desk, a folding table, because the actual furniture was coming next week, and said, "Everything?" "Everything," he said. She stood up and looked out the window. From the 4th floor, she could see west toward the river and north toward the merchandise mart and east toward the lake, which was doing its usual thing of being enormous and indifferent and quietly magnificent. "I want to offer you something," she said. "A bonus is not a bonus." She turned from the window. "I want to offer you a contract. Retained restoration consultant for the firm, ongoing. The building is going to need continued attention as we occupy it, and I'm going to be acquiring other properties over the next 3 years. I have 2 already under letter of intent. I want someone on those assessments from the beginning." She paused. "Someone who reads the inspection reports first." He was quiet for a moment, not uncomfortable quiet, considering quiet, which was different. "That's a significant commitment," he said. "It is. I'd need to restructure some of my other work. I know. I'm not asking you to decide today." He looked at her steadily. There was something in his expression that she had seen occasionally over the past 7 weeks, in moments of decision, when he was about to tell her something she might not want to hear, but needed to. That looked like the particular shape of a person who has decided to be honest, regardless of consequence. "I'll decide today," he said. She waited. "Yes," he said. Outside, the lake went on being enormous. Somewhere on the ground floor, a door opened and Willa's voice floated up the stairwell. She had come with Mrs. Paulson to pick up her dad and was apparently informing Phil from facilities about the difference between shield volcanoes and stratovolcanoes with the pedagogical authority of someone who has done extensive research. Laurel smiled. It was a small smile, not performed for anyone, just the real involuntary kind. "She's going to be formidable," Laurel said. Jonah listened to his daughter's voice carrying up through the building he had just put back together. "She already is," he said. The Alderton building opened its doors 6 weeks later, on a morning that was bright and cold and smelled like the lake. The first person through the lobby was Willa, who had been promised a tour and arrived with a notebook and a list of questions about the elevator. The bronze doors opened and closed 3 times before she was satisfied. Laurel watched from across the lobby and thought about things that survive, about buildings and companies and people who are made of better material than they appear, about the particular intelligence required to look at a structure, any structure, a building or a deal or a relationship, and see not just what it is, but what it was designed to become. Jonah had seen it in a ceiling, in a drainage channel, in a set of measurements that didn't add up. She had spent 14 years learning to see it in balance sheets and capital structures, and the way a management team behaved under pressure. Some things you rebuild. Some things you build for the first time, carefully, on ground you have tested yourself. She didn't know yet what shape the next thing would take. She thought that was probably fine. The building was sound. The work was good. The morning light was coming through the tall east-facing windows and landing in long, warm rectangles on the shiniest floors Willa Marks had ever seen.